speaker tonight, Chris Mackowski. We had him here to speak on the last 4 days of Stonewall Jackson, and he was definitely captivating. So I'm not going to do any more time here. Chris, you're on. So welcome, Chris. The last time he was here, he drove from New York. Now you're in Virginia, Fredericksburg. So now he drove up from Fredericksburg. And he's going to drive home with me.
So I'm always delighted to come back to Hershey. I lived here during my early days, all the way through 6th grade. Came home to find my house on fire one day. That ended my time in Hershey. So I'm always glad to come back under happier circumstances. So thank you so much for the invitation. Tom, thank you so much. Ricky, Gene, thank you so much for your hospitality today. Just a couple bits of business before I begin. My young assistant, my executive vice president, my cousin Jack, he is visiting from Southern California. His grandmother lives in Mount Gretna, and I've asked him to come along. He passed out some flyers for me. You may recognize these rack cards are from the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. I firmly believe that battlefield preservation is vital to our understanding of the Civil War because having those outdoor classrooms allows us to understand the military history in ways that we just can't understand other ways. Central Virginia Battlefields Trust, I'm sure all familiar with the American Battlefield Trust, which is like the big guy in the street. They do some fantastic stuff. They have a nationwide scope. I do a lot of work for them. I appreciate those of you who support ABT. But Central Virginia Battlefields Trust really focuses on the 4 main battlefields around Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. And since I'm here tonight to speak about the Wilderness, I thought I would pass out their cards just as an opportunity. If you're interested in supporting battlefield preservation on the areas that we'll be spending time together on, would love to have your support for CVBT. So thank you for your consideration. I'm here with an organization called Emerging Civil War. There are 30 of us public historians who contribute free content every day to a blog, www.emergingcivilwar.com. And our mission is to spread the gospel of the Civil War. We're really trying to make sure we help people connect with what we believe to be America's defining event. And so we're out there just trying to share this history because, of course, if we don't stay connected with it, we are doomed to repeat our mistakes. And we fail to learn from the wisdom that we can glean from our own history. So that's why we're out there trying to really help people connect. We do have a monthly newsletter. If folks are interested, feel free to put your name and email address on this sign-up sheet. I'll pass it around. I promise we won't spam you, but we do have a newsletter that we send out that just lets you know what we're up to, where we're publishing, where we're speaking, what projects we have going on. With 30 of us, there's a lot. So we'd love to have you kind of be part of our community that way. We do have an annual symposium. This year will be our 6th annual symposium. It's the first weekend in August. It's held on the Spotsylvania battlefield. This year's theme is Forgotten Battles. Our keynote speaker is Will Green, the former executive director of Pamplin Park. We've got 10 speakers over the course of 2 days. Plus, on the 3rd day, we have a tour of the Jericho Mills battlefield down at North Anna River. $155 a ticket. If you're interested, we have information on our blog, or you can check with me afterwards. Last bit of business, you may see the shameless promotion up here. My daughter just got married at the end of March. I'm still paying that off. So please, feel free to come up and see me. I do have books on the Wilderness Overland Campaign. I do have a couple Gettysburg books for those of you who are familiar with that little battlefield down the road from here. So feel free to come up and see me. Now I'm going to begin tonight by saying something that may shock some of you, particularly if you are partial to that little battlefield down the road. How many of you have heard of Gettysburg as the turning point of the Civil War? Balderdash. That's hogwash, and I'm going to tell you why tonight. When Ulysses S. Grant, as commander of all Union armies, opens the spring campaign in 1864, he says, there will be no turning back. And he holds true to that promise, which he makes to a newspaper correspondent, so it appears in print. He's on record as saying there will be no turning back. And as a result, he will fundamentally change the nature of the entire Civil War. To understand what happens, we're going to place the Union Army in its winter camps out here in Culpeper. I don't want to yell too loud to wake up folks down the hall. They're out here in Culpeper. Here's the Rapidan River. What Grant wants to do is lead the Army of the Potomac down into that room, which is going to be Spotsylvania Courthouse. He doesn't particularly care about Spotsylvania Courthouse. He doesn't care about the village. He doesn't care about the courthouse building. What he cares about is the road network that will allow him to have the inside track to Richmond. He doesn't care about Richmond. Now, up to this point in the war, it's been all about capture the flag. Basically, let's capture the enemy capital. We'll win the war that way, right? Grant says no. When he takes command of all Union armies, he says that it is going to be Lee's army that is the objective for the Army of the Potomac. And if by no other means than attrition, the Federals will simply wear the Confederates out. He's going to mobilize armies all across the board to move at once so that Confederates can't shift reinforcements from one army to the other. In Virginia, he's going to come across the Rapidan River towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. But he's also going to send an army under Franz Sigel up the Shenandoah Valley. He's going to send an army under Benjamin Butler up the Virginia Peninsula past Bermuda Hundred to threaten the capital. All in an attempt to tie Confederates down so they can't shift reinforcements. And as Grant moves towards Spotsylvania Courthouse, his objective is to draw Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia into open field combat, where Grant can use his numerical superiority to simply overwhelm the Confederates. Grant's got about 120,000 men to start this campaign. Lee is going to have about 66,000 men. So almost 2-to-1 odds. But up to this point, the Union Army has not been able to exert its numerical superiority. And that's what Grant wants to do. He needs to do that because 1864, as you know, is an election year. Lincoln's up for re-election, and if this war drags on, Lincoln's election prospects dwindle. So Grant really wants to get that knockout blow if he can. A war of annihilation. But if that doesn't work, his fallback plan is this war of attrition. If by no other means than attrition, he'll wear the Confederates out. So that's what things look like at the beginning of May, when he finally sets his army into motion. His top lieutenant, if you will, a guy named George Gordon Meade. Those of you who are familiar with Gettysburg know Meade well. He's commander of the Army of the Potomac. A lot of people think he's been replaced, but in fact, he has not been. He's still commander. When Grant comes to take over the army, it's like having your boss tag along with you. Now imagine those dynamics. And I work for a wonderful boss, but I still can't imagine him over my shoulder all the time. But that's what's going to happen. Grant's plan is to let Meade run the show. And he's going to pretend like he's in his office back in Washington directing all the army movements all across the board. As we'll see, Grant really doesn't have the temperament for that. He becomes more and more hands-on as the campaign goes forward. But his intention is to let Meade run the show. He says, head to Spotsylvania, let's get Lee out in the open, and let's give him a good old walloping. But as you know, Robert E. Lee tends to follow his own playbook, not the playbook designed by his enemy. And so as Grant has his eye on Spotsylvania, Lee has his eye on Grant. He doesn't know what Grant's going to do. He's got to wait for Grant to make the first move. But as soon as Grant begins this move towards Spotsylvania, Lee, who's encamped down the hall behind you, around Orange Courthouse, is going to move in this direction and try to intercept Grant. The reason why is because this area where you're sitting, a 70 square mile deciduous jungle known as the Wilderness. This is the Virginia frontier. Since the 1770s, this area has been mined for the iron ore that is rich in the soil. And you see that around here a lot. That's what makes the soil red, all that iron in it. Well, in order to process that iron ore, to take it to a bunch of local furnaces in the area, down in Spotsylvania, in Chancellorsville, for instance, there's the Catherine furnace that's still on the Chancellorsville battlefield. But if you've got a furnace, that means you need fire. If you've got fire, that means you need wood, charcoal. And that's the other natural resource that's been abundant in this area, is the forests. And so they have been clear-cut to provide fuel for these local furnaces. So by the 1860s, when the armies finally moved through here, first in the Chancellorsville campaign, in May of '63, and the Mine Run campaign in November of '63, now again in May of '64, those clear cuts have started to grow back. So you don't have tall, majestic forests like we'll see on our field trip in November. I'm just going to keep sliding in those little plugs, by the way. When you come to the wilderness in November. So instead, what you have is second growth forest that's still growing. So it's all foliage that's thick, dense, fighting for sunlight, 10 feet tall. You have whiplash oaks, scraggly pine, rhododendrons, pricker bushes, holly bushes, wild grapevine, prickers of all sorts, wild roses, and it's all full of snakes and ticks. Exactly. A more infernal place for a battlefield one could not conceive, a federal officer said. Another likened it to one of the dark places of Dante's Inferno. People called it the dark, close wood. And Grant, looking at the map, knows that he needs to get through the wilderness as quickly as possible because this is a terrible place for a fight. But that's exactly why Robert E. Lee wants to pick the fight there. Because in this wilderness, Grant can't deploy his numerical superiority. He can't get all his men onto the field at once. He can't get his cavalry to move effectively. He can't deploy his artillery. So Lee, by attacking here, can even out those numbers. On the map, Grant sees a straight shot. He wants to get through the wilderness in a single day. He gets about partway through, maybe halfway through. And the army has to stop for the night on the evening of May 4th. Grant learns his first important lesson now that he's come east. He's used to his Western armies that move fast, quick. They're mobile, they're agile, they're adaptable. The Army of the Potomac, he discovers, is big and slow and cumbersome and ungainly. It is powerful, but it is slow. And so it does not make that move nearly as fast as Grant likes. So they stop overnight in the one place Grant doesn't want to stop. On the morning of May 5th, as his troops begin to get back into line and continue the march, Federal skirmishers posted a little way down this road, which we're going to call the Orange Turnpike, as they're kind of protecting the flank of the Union Army, they see off in the distance gray troops. They're not supposed to be there. Last we heard, the Confederate Army was still backed by orange. What are these troops doing? And in fact, this is the vanguard of Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps, once under the command of the famed Stonewall Jackson. And Robert E. Lee has put them on the Orange Turnpike to intercept the Federal column. On a parallel road, he's got his 3rd Corps under A.P. Hill, marching along the Orange Plank Road. Notice that that's not quite the straight shot. We've got a little bit of curve. We've got some twists and turns. So it's going to take Hill a little longer to get to the wilderness along the Orange Plank Road than it takes Ewell to come along the Orange Plank Road. Ewell is under orders not to bring on an open engagement. Instead, he's under orders to make contact, keep the Federals distracted, hold them in place, but don't bring on a general engagement. So when he shows up with insight of the Federal 5th Corps, he begins to deploy his troops along the edge of a ridgeline that happens to conveniently go where this couch and this back row are. Thank you all for your positioning. In this area in front of the couch is an open space called Saunders Field. Dave, you've got this look on your face like, oh my God, I'm in the wrong spot now. You're about to have a really tough couple days. I apologize. So Ewell begins to deploy. Meanwhile, the Federals, shocked to see those Confederates, send word back to 5th Corps Commander Gouverneur K. Warren. We all know Warren from his service at Gettysburg, where he directs troops into the spot at Little Round Top that saves the Union left flank, gets his own fabulous statue atop Little Round Top, earning Meade's trust. He's a rising star of the Army of the Potomac as a result of that. Does well at Bristow Station, bloodying A.P. Hill's nose. Does well at Mine Run, although he calls off a massive attack, worried about the Confederate position. Meade, when he sees it for himself, agrees. Here's a man, young hotshot. In fact, there's been some talk when Grant came east, if he needed to replace Meade as commander of the Army, maybe Warren's the guy to be the new commander. So we got this young hotshot. He's got something to prove. Now finally in permanent command of the Corps. Sees the Confederates in front of him. Tells his boss. Grant immediately says, if you see any portion of the Confederate Army, do not wait to make dispositions, but instead pitch into them immediately. Warren gets that. All right, the boss wants me to pitch in. And so he starts to dig in, making the very dispositions Grant told him not to worry about. Grant's eager for a fight, but Warren, being an engineer, with all eyes on him, reputation to protect, is going to play it cautious. And so he's going to allow a couple hours to elapse while his men dig in to a position that roughly corresponds with our check-in table in this second row. By doing so, he gives Ewell more time to dig in himself. And more of Ewell's corps comes to the battlefield and begins to fill in along this ridgeline. Finally, Warren feels like he's got enough preparations, but his right flank is in the air. He doesn't have any protection over here. He's told that John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, which is coming up the road behind him, will fill in on his right and serve as protection. Go forward, Sedgwick will be there. So Warren tells his division commanders, get ready to go in, Sedgwick will be there. And on his extreme right are his U.S. regulars. John Griffin's an old Indian fighter. He's a grizzled fellow who knows his business, and he's like, my right flank is unprotected, and if you send me across that field, I'm going to get chewed up. He says he's only going to go under protest, because he knows what's about to happen. And Warren assures him Sedgwick will be there. Well, Uncle John Sedgwick doesn't quite get here in time. And so, Warren will send his men forward, the first attack coming across this open field, the rest of his division off into the woods to the south of the turnpike. So these men will start to get jumbled almost immediately because they're trying to march through this dense forest shoulder to shoulder as you guys are seated now. Imagine trying to hold formation with the jungle itself holding you back. And so Warren's advance will become problematic from the beginning. As his troops under Roman heirs get into this open field called Saunders Field, they begin to take a withering fire from the Confederates who are posted on the ridge. Worse, they begin to take a crossfire from across the road. And then things get even worse because partway across the field, there's this big ditch, which you will be able to see if you come on our field trip in November. There's a big swale that cuts diagonally and ends in the woods here. And Ewell's men as they've continued to extend, see this swale. And the Stonewall Brigade, many of you are familiar with them, they position themselves at the head of the swale and fire down, using it as a firing alley. As a result, the U.S. regulars who are making that advance, they're on the right flank, they will veer off to the right to try to counteract that threat. In doing so, they're going to open up a line, or open up a hole in the federal line. The troops that continue straight forward, that are using the road as their avenue and axis of advance, will find themselves without protection on their right flank because of that divergence. Some of those troops, for instance, the 140th New York, the fire zouaves from Rochester, are going to take such horrific casualties out in that field because they are so exposed. That unit takes 49% casualties. And they can't really do anything other than stay out there and take it. So they will continue to push onward right to where Dave is sitting, where there will be an intense hand-to-hand fight in the Confederate works themselves. In the meantime, 2 pieces of Federal artillery will come and park themselves right about here and begin shelling the Confederate line. So the Federals will start taking friendly fire in the midst of this hand-to-hand combat. Finally, Griffin's men will crumble back. The New Yorkers in the trenches will begin to crumble back, having to run the gauntlet, and they're in their bright red zouave uniforms, which makes them perfect targets. And the advance will collapse. Meanwhile, in the woods, as the Federal forces continue to try to push their way through, they start to run into a few small farms that are in this area, including Permelia Higgerson's farm. And Permelia's seat is right here about where Steve is sitting. Ed Bars calls Permelia Higginson the ugliest woman in the Civil War. She lives a very hard scrabble life out on this farm. Her first husband died. Her second husband ran off with her daughter. It's been a rough life for Permelia. And in her house, she sees the Federals sweep forward. And she starts heckling them. She said, "Oh, I got Confederates in my backyard. We're going to see you come running back through here in just a few minutes." The Federals are like, sure enough, they run into more of Ewell's men who are posted behind Permelia's house. And those Federals do come a-tumbling backwards. Many of them find themselves caught in a piece of low ground, a little swamp that, Steve, if you are Permelia, the swamp is kind of here. And the Federals are trying to get their way through the swamp. And one of Ewell's brigadier, a guy named John Brown Gordon, lawyer from Georgia, some of you might know, he discovers this gap created by this swamp. And he swings around and hits the Federals on the flank, driving them into and through the swamp in disarray. So as more and more Federals sweep in that direction, coming to grief as more and more of Ewell's men come down to meet them, they tumble back into this direction, back toward Warren's initial line. There's a nice stately house on the battlefield right about here called Elwood. Nice, clear, open plantation grounds around it. Warren's going to make his headquarters there, and he'll try to see the action. But the woods are pretty impenetrable. It's a pretty confusing battle for him to try to follow. But he sees scattered remnants of his forces streaming out of the woods. So he's trying to kind of get a bead on what's going on. Some of those forces, for instance, among them, the Iron Brigade, who do such fantastic work in the first day at Gettysburg, they run like little children. They are so overwhelmed here in the wilderness. They will actually be reformed and sent back in toward the Orange Plank Road in a little while. But they have a very bad early afternoon in the wilderness. Some Federal units do have success. The 20th Maine, for instance, they break through Ewell's line. Sorry to do this to you, Ricky. And they get all the way like a mile and a half in the rear to find themselves cut off, isolated. trying to figure out what to do. They have a company or a regiment vote, and they're going to fight their way back rather than surrender. One of the officers in the division pops out of the woods on the side of Saunders Field, only 50 yards in front of the Confederate line. The Confederates start taking pot shots at him. He rears his horse up and bolts back toward the Federal position. Confederates firing him at the whole time, Josiah Bartlett. And just as he's about to make it to safety, his horse leaps a ditch, and the horse is shot out from underneath him and rolls over on top of him. Confederates stream out into the field to try to capture him. He peels himself out from under his horse, hobbles the last few yards into the woods, and finds safety in the Federal lines. Confederates who actually write about it talk about being one of the most incredible things they've ever seen in the war. But the fight here in the wilderness, as it opens up, quickly becomes that kind of individual fighting. Unit cohesion breaks down completely because the woods themselves are working against both armies. But because the Federals are on the offense, they're going to have the worst time of it. Ewell's going to keep bringing men down here, trying to fill in along this line and stretch further south, knowing that A.P. Hill is on his way at some point, at some time. Meanwhile, there's going to be a Federal unit, the far left flank, Samuel Crawford's Pennsylvania Reserves. They're going to break their way through and get to about where Gary's at, a place called the Tuning Farm. It's the highest point on the battlefield. Samuel Crawford has got a great view of what's going on, and he can see the woods are just full of chaos. He can see all the way back to Warren's headquarters at Elwood. He knows if the Federals hold this piece of high ground, it's a great place to deploy their artillery. They can command the battlefield. They can park and make the Confederates come at them. So he sends word back, like, hey, I'm at this great spot. But then he notices A.P. Hill's men coming down the road. Now, for those of you who can turn around and see, as everyone's go, okay, we've got to turn around finally. Okay. A.P. Hill's men are marching down this road. So as I get this far, I'm heading toward a little intersection here. What have I just done to Crawford sitting on that piece of high ground? I have isolated him, right? I have now outflanked you. And you can see there's all this fighting going on here. You've got Confederates here. And Sam Crawford has a big uh-oh moment. And he will get orders to pull off that piece of high ground, even though he recognizes that it is a fantastic spot to hold. He realizes at this juncture he can't hold it, and he's going to abandon the tuning farm. A.P. Hill is aiming for an intersection right here. This is the straight road from the Rapidan to Spotsylvania Courthouse. If this is the plank road, okay, this is called the Brock Road. This intersection becomes vital. If Hill can capture it, he's going to cut Grant off. If Grant can capture it, he's going to give himself more options. So when he gets word that Hill is coming up this road, he looks for someone to get there first. First people he sees is George Getty, leading the 6th Corps down the road. So the 6th Corps doesn't come in on the 5th Corps' flank because they've got to get down there. And Grant orders them on the hustle, and they double quick. Getty and his staff of about 12 on horseback ride down to the intersection to check things out first. When they arrive, they can see Hill's vanguard. And he begins to shout out orders to deploy his troops both sides of the intersection in double lines. Get the artillery up. Get those emplacements ready. Prepare for the enemy to attack. And he just starts shouting out orders as though his whole division is with him. He's got 12 guys. The reason this works is because leading Hill's Corps is Henry Heath. Henry Heath is under orders to not bring on a general engagement. For students of the Battle of Gettysburg, you may recall Henry Heath leading the 3rd Corps under orders not to bring on a general engagement, and he does. And look what happens. A few months later, in the Mine Run campaign, Heath is coming down this very same road in the vanguard of Hill's corps, under orders not to bring on general engagements. And he gets himself embroiled in a fight. So now history is repeating itself yet again. And finally, Heath learns his lesson. And he, rather than pushing forward, will deploy his men in the woods. But one time you wish he had not learned his lesson. Because had he pushed forward, George Getty and 12 men are the only ones holding that intersection. And instead, Hill will deploy in the woods here and prepare to move forward. That gives Getty enough opportunity to get his division up and deploy as well. In the meantime, as Grant's moving into the wilderness, his army is so big he can't move them all under the same roads. So he's got Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps crossing the river at a different spot that brings them down through the old Chancellorsville battlefield. And he's heading toward a place called Todd's Tavern, which is kind of that little supply closet back there, almost to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Hancock gets that far and is told, Lee has attacked, we need you. And so Hancock is going to come up the Brock Road to fill in with Getty's division. And that's going to give basically a corps and a half of strength to hold this intersection. And eventually Getty is told to move forward. And he will initiate the attacks. Heath will wait. And so then fighting starts along this axis, even as it's starting to calm down on that axis. And the fighting is of a kind these soldiers have not experienced before. They came into the same wilderness a year before, Chancellorsville, a little further to the east. They found the forest then dense, thick, choked. Here it's also dense and thick and choked. But now, because of the heavy leaf litter on the ground, forest fires begin to erupt. And there were a couple forest fires at Chancellorsville, but there are going to be some 13 different fires that will open up here in the wilderness over the course of the next few days. And as these men get into that wilderness and into the fires, that comparison to Dante's Inferno suddenly becomes pretty vivid. And as they try to maintain unit cohesion and it breaks down, it becomes what one soldier describes as bushwhacking on a grand scale, a description that was also used in Chickamauga. And it becomes a soldier's fight, where you can't see the guy next to you, but you can see the guy that you're shooting at in front of you. And many men talk about, for the first time, being able to see the man they shoot. Be able to see the man they kill. Smoke, and guns, and smoke from the fires, and the thickness of the brush just makes things impenetrable. This becomes what one soldier calls horror in the forest. And Hill will continue to deploy his men out into the forest on either side. Meanwhile, the 5th Corps, trying to recover from what's going on over here along the turnpike, they're going to send reinforcements into that fight. The Iron Brigade is going to, instead of pushing forward as it has, push diagonally through the wilderness and try to hit Hill on the flank. Robert E. Lee, by this point, is at the tuning farm. He can see the Iron Brigade coming. He sees that they're aiming for a vulnerable spot, and he's got no one to send to the aid of A.P. Hill's men. He looks around, he's got like survivors streaming to the rear, he's got ambulance men, he sees a band, and he tells all of them, get together and plug that hole. And with a few dozen men who then plunge into the wilderness, right here, they intercept the Iron Brigade, which is caught completely off guard, thrown pell-mell back into the rear. For the second time that day, the Iron Brigade meets grief in the wilderness and is repulsed. That's going to staunch whatever vulnerability Lee has, and darkness will finally descend over the battlefield. That evening, one of A.P. Hill's division commanders, Henry Heath, comes to him and he says, I think I should have my men dig in, because if the Federals attack us in the morning, we're pretty vulnerable. We don't have very good topography. We should dig in. And Hill says, no. They've been fighting all day. They had a forced march up here. They're exhausted. Tomorrow morning, James Longstreet will be here. In fact, tonight, James Longstreet will be here. He will relieve us. So let's let your men rest, because we're going to pull them out and put Longstreet's in instead. But Heath goes back to a fellow division commander, Cadmus Wilcox, whose men are also exhausted, also vulnerable, also feeling a little iffy. And Heath goes back to Hill again, and he says, could we please dig in? We're not feeling comfortable out there. And Hill orders him to stop asking and says, if you ask again, I will put you under arrest. Longstreet will be here to relieve us. Let your men rest. Now, this story comes to us from Heath. Hill, as you know, dies in the last days of the war. He doesn't get to tell his side of this story. Heath is trying to redeem his reputation, which is tarnished from Gettysburg and now from this poor day. So perhaps we take what Heath says with a grain of salt. But the fact remains, Hill did not let his men dig in. Longstreet is coming. In fact, by this point, Longstreet and his men are encamped, almost 20 miles to the rear. They have disembarked trains that have brought them from Knoxville, Tennessee, where they were out west during the fall and winter, showing up at the crucial moment during the Battle of Chickamauga to swing the tide of battle and win the day for the Confederates. Hunkered down for the rest of the winter in Knoxville, and when Lee brought them back east, he had them disembark at Gordonsville, and he kept them there. And I say that because Longstreet sometimes catches flack for not being on this battlefield sooner, but in fact, it was right where Lee told him to be. The reason being is that where Longstreet was stationed, he could come here to the battlefield if necessary, or if Grant got around Lee, Longstreet was in a position to intercept. So Longstreet was back to the rear as far as he was under Lee's orders to be sort of a swing force. Once Lee initiates battle here and he recognizes this is where the battlefield is going to be, he calls Longstreet up. But nobody tells Longstreet that there is urgency, and so he follows regular protocol, marching 50 minutes, resting for 10, 50 minutes, resting for 10. He takes a camp, and someone finds his men encamped, tell them that the battle is going on, we need you at the front. Longstreet rouses his men, gets them to move at the double quick to the battlefield. They have to eventually cut their own way cross country to get here in time. Old Pete knows that there's trouble, and he's trying to get his men here as quickly as possible. Hill's expecting them sometime after midnight. They don't show up. It's going to be a problem because this is the exact part of the battlefield that Ulysses S. Grant is now looking at. Grant's trying to figure out how can he resume the initiative, take the offensive in the morning. What he wants to do is have Sedgwick skirmish here to hold the Confederates in place while he uses the rest of the army, 3/4 of the army, for a massive concentrated attack down this road. Hancock is going to be the fist. Sedgwick is going to be up there doing his diversion, 5th Corps, 9th Corps under Ambrose Burnside is going to kind of slide in through here. And then the 5th will kind of add support like the Iron Brigade tried to do on this flank as well. Attack set for 4 o'clock in the morning. Burnside says, my men will be on the road by 4:30. I'm not sure how that time works out, but one of Hancock's staff members says, I know Burnside well, he will not be here. Let's not count on it. In fact, by 9:30 in the morning, Burnside will still be sitting here where Dick is having breakfast at the Wilderness Tavern. Burnside will be a non-factor in this attack, which does launch at 4:30. Hill's exhausted men, Heath, Wilcox, not dug in, suddenly get hammered, and hammered, driven pell-mell back through the wilderness in complete, exhausted, confused disarray. Driven so far that Lee looks at one unit and says, who are these men running like geese? Sam McGowan, South Carolinians. Fine bunch of men with a distinguished service record. And McGowan is mortified to have Lee call them geese. And he says, General Lee, my men are just looking for a place to reform. If we have that opportunity, we will go back in and we will prove ourselves. But the army is in such disarray that finally the Federals are exhausted, not by Confederate resistance, but by the wilderness itself, which works against their advance. But they get so far, there's an open field here where Tim is sitting, called the Widow Tap Field. There's an old lady who lives there with her children. They go running off as the armies begin fighting. There are 12 to 16 guns posted in this field. Pogue's guns are the only thing keeping Lee's army from complete rout and destruction. Even as Hancock's men begin to push toward the edge of that field and Pogue's gunners blasting away for all they're worth, someone spots down the road the approach of James Longstreet. Lee rides out to meet them. He says to the first troops, who are you? And they say, we are Texans. And Lee says, Texans, they always do. And he's going to lead those men personally into battle to try to stop this rout. Except the men refuse to go. They begin to shout out, General Lee to the rear. General Lee to the rear. We will not go forward unless General Lee goes to the rear. They recognize Lee as the indispensable man of the Confederacy, and they do not want their commander to put himself in harm's way. So some poor schmuck of a corporal has to take the reins of Lee's horse and lead a very angry Lee to the rear, while the Texans begin to form up for a counterattack. James Longstreet at this point rides up and with great diplomacy says, well, General Lee, I see I'm not needed here. If you'd like, I can go to the rear and take care of events back there.
Sounds like
And
Trump,
Lee,
doesn't he? Leading from the front?
recognizing Longstreet's point, reluctantly allows himself to be led away, and Longstreet will form up his men for this counterattack. They have been marching all night, but they have shown up at the exact spot, at the exact moment of crisis. And Longstreet pushes them forward with all of the might available to a man who's known as Robert E. Lee's old warhorse. And the confused, exhausted Federals are not able to withstand those assaults, and they begin to get pounded backwards. The attacks are so successful, Longstreet's going to launch another one. And in doing so, he's going to have one of his subordinates, Moxley Sorrell, as chief of staff, suggest that they try a flank attack similar to Jackson. There's an old abandoned railroad cut that runs through the woods over here. Sorrell is going to lead 5 brigades into this railroad cut to get on the Federal flank and push forward. And even as that hammer comes sweeping through, and I think about Dick's Vermonters who are on that flank, and they're going to take an awful beating, but nobody could hold that ground. The Vermonters do tremendous work on that flank, but they are overwhelmed. And as the flank attack drives the Federals back, into the melee rides James Wadsworth, Brigadier General, leading one of the divisions of the 5th Corps, including the Iron Brigade, which has come to grief twice before, and he brings them in again to try to stop this rout. And they are quickly overwhelmed again. Wadsworth, trying to rally his men, will get shot down. Confederates will find him lying alongside the road with his head grievously wounded, brain matter oozing out. He'll be taken to the rear to a field hospital where a local farmer will actually come and tend to Wadsworth for the next day and a half until Wadsworth quietly dies. This is a man who, a couple of years earlier when Wadsworth was commander of the garrison in Washington, this man had been brought before Wadsworth as a supposed Confederate spy. When Wadsworth talked to him and realized this guy's just a farmer, he lets the guy go. And in repayment of that act of kindness, this farmer comes back to tend to Wadsworth in his dying hours. He'll make sure the body gets back to Wadsworth's family in upstate New York. Meanwhile, here on the road, as Longstreet's attack continues and Federals try to defend, he's going to try another forward assault. But many of his men who've made this flank attack have gotten lost in the woods. Forest fires divert them from their path of attack. One unit, the 23rd Virginia, actually gets across the road and into the woods here. Discovering they have no one on either side, they realize they're lost, and they circle around and come back, even as more Virginians come out of the woods here. And as you have these two converging forces, Longstreet at the head of his column will get caught between them, and they spook each other. A crossfire erupts, and Longstreet will get shot through the neck and shoulder. A grievous wound that begins to bleed profusely. One of his brigadiers, Micah Jenkins, will be killed. Joseph Kershaw, another division commander, rides into the melee and says, "Stop, friends!" And the fighting calms down and everyone understands what has happened. The dark specter hangs over these woods, one Confederate staff officer said. 1 year and 3 days earlier, 3 miles that way as the crow flies, Stonewall Jackson was shot down by his own men after leading a successful flank attack in the wilderness. And now the same thing has happened to James Washington. This incident, which happens about 12:30, will bring the Confederate counterattacks to a halt. The man in charge now, the next senior man in the field, is Charles Field. He doesn't really have enough experience. He's new to the Corps. The men don't really know him, and so Lee himself is going to have to come to this part of the battlefield and take over. And it will take almost 4 hours to get everything squared away, get the men reconfigured, and prepare to resume the assault. The Federals, meanwhile, are going to hunker down at the Brock Road-Plank Road intersection. They're going to have 3 rows of defense, and they're going to spend those 4 hours digging and digging and digging. So when Lee finally launches that attack at 4 o'clock, the Federals have extremely strong defenses. And with the earthworks catching fire, the Confederates throw themselves against those positions, and they break through. And they break through the second line, and only the third line holds as more reinforcements from the Federal Army come in and try to stop the breach. And for 20 minutes, there's intense fighting here around the intersection before the Confederates are finally repulsed. One unit plants its flag in the burning works before being driven off. It was the high tide for Lee at this battle. So the fighting's not over quite yet. All the way over here by Saunders Field, that precocious Georgia lawyer, John Brown Gordon, has a great idea. If he can march his men all the way out here past the flank, he can assault the 6th Corps sitting over here. He and his commander, Jubal Early, have been going back and forth about this plan all day. Early and his commander, Richard Ewell, have been going back and forth about this plan all day. History has given us 3 competing versions of what happened. But what ends up happening turns out to be too little too late. Because Gordon will make that flank attack. He will hit Sedgwick's men. He will drive them through the forest. Darkness will finally bring an end to this assault. Sedgwick's men will hold, and Gordon will have to withdraw. That ends the fighting on the north side. At one point during the battle, someone came to Grant and told him, Lee's doing this, and Lee's doing that, and Lee's going to get us here, and we should pull back. And finally, Grant snapped. He'd been sitting next to a tree all day whittling. He whittled so much that he cut holes in the tips of the fingers of his gloves. He smoked his way through 20 cigars. But he sat there. And he finally snaps and says, to listen to it, Robert E. Lee is about to hit us on both flanks simultaneously while also doing a double somersault to land in our rear. I expect you to pay more attention about what we're going to do to Lee rather than what Lee's going to do to us. That's a change in temperament. Commander of the Potomac, which has spent a lot of time worrying about Robert E. Lee. But as the fighting continued, and Grant really got a sense of just how horrific it was, he actually retires to his tent. And according to one of his staff members, let loose his feelings in a way that could not be mistaken. In other words, he begins to cry, loudly enough that his staff can hear him outside. But he comes out of his tent and he sits down by the fire, and with that same resolve that he had after the first night of fighting at Shiloh, when William T. Sherman said, the devil has had his own day today, hasn't he? And Grant says, lick him tomorrow. There by the fire, he has that same sense of resolve. Lick him tomorrow. Now, after 2 days of fighting, Grant considers things. And on the morning of the 7th of May, he has basically 2 choices. He can retreat, or he can keep fighting. Maybe there's a 3rd choice. Maybe we can just march to Spotsylvania Courthouse like we intended. After all, there will be no turning back. And so he cuts orders. On the evening of the 7th, as his army has skirmished with Confederates throughout the day, some of that skirmishing is so intense that men stack up the bodies of the dead and wounded in front of them to act as barricades. Some of them dragging wounded men out of the forest as the fires rage around them. It's an awful sort of day. That evening, Grant rides to the Brock Road, Plank Road intersection, continues on toward the Spotsylvania Courthouse. And his men understand the implications of going that way because he is not going that way. He's not withdrawing back at the Chancellorsville to go across the river. He is not going that way, back across the river to Culpeper. He's just going around. And men begin to cheer wildly. Up to this point, the armies would fight, they would disengage, and might spend a couple months reinforcing, resupplying, re-equipping before they would fight again. But Grant does not want to give Confederates that time to catch their breath. By doing so, it's going to drag out the war. This is now a war of attrition, if by no other means. Do not give the Confederates time to catch their breath. And so he will lead the army to Spotsylvania Courthouse. With the woods burning around them, Robert E. Lee will get his men on the road, cutting their own path through the wilderness to escape, marching twice as far to intercept Grant at the door of Spotsylvania Courthouse by 7:30 on the morning of the 8th. And I invite you to consider, these men started fighting on the 5th, fighting on the 6th, basically fighting and skirmishing throughout the 7th, marching overnight on the 7th, and start fighting on the 8th, 10 miles down the road. And that will last for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks at Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant again can't get at Lee. Go around again. Down to the banks of the North Anna River. Can't get at Lee there, we'll go around again. To Totopotomoy Creek, to Bethesda Church, to Cold Harbor, across the James River, to Petersburg, and just keep going around Lee's flank. And eventually, they will end up at Appomattox Courthouse. What happens here in the wilderness, what begins in Saunders Field on the 5th of May, 1864, leads inexorably to Appomattox Courthouse 11 months later. And that's why I say that Grant's decision here at the Brock Road, Plank Road intersection is the turning point of the war. After Gettysburg, Lee is free to move with impunity up and down Virginia. His strategic situation hasn't changed at all. But here, Grant's just going to keep hammering, hammering, hammering. If by no other means than attrition, he will simply lose the Confederates. There will be no turning back. This road will go all the way to Appomattox.
While our speaker's getting a drink, once again, we've got flyers in the back. If you want to, see what he just described to us in November,
Well, I'm not busy, so.
grab a flyer
All right, bye.
and give a check to Norm before you leave here tonight.
Or Norm takes cash.
I take that.
Questions? Questions? Yes.
Chris, when the fighting was over here on that Plank Road,
Yes.
is he fighting Second Corps?
He does start fighting Second Corps. There are some 6th Corps units that are mixed in here,
Okay.
but mostly it's going to be Second Corps.
So when Grant decides to shift down to the courthouse, what was the order of battle?
Okay. So
Continue.
what he's going to do is he's going to ask the 5th Corps
Fifth.
to slide down behind the 9th and the 2nd and lead the way.
Okay,
6th Corps will then slide down to follow.
right.
Then 9th Corps is going to swing up through Chancellorsville, hook around further to the east, come down the Fredericksburg Road. And the 2nd Corps is going to bring up the rear. That's going to be problematic because as we get down to Spotsylvania Courthouse, Lee's going to be able to bottleneck that road. So again, Grant's got 3/4 of his army on that road and he can't deploy them all because of that bottleneck. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, thanks for a great lecture again. It sounds like the commanders, Grant and Lee, really had a hard time just from a tactical point of view because of the confusion, the terrain, the forest. I mean, could either one of them, in your opinion, looking back 150 years later, have conducted the battle better or differently? Or were they just like, it was just such confusion that there's really not much they could have done better, that it was just a god-awful mess?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is it's a god-awful mess. I think Lee could have communicated better with Longstreet to just let him know of the urgency. Although Longstreet's arrival is a great story and very dramatic and all that stuff. But I don't really think either commander could have conducted this any differently than they had. In part, Grant's trying to learn how to not only use his army, but how to work with Meade and Burnside, who's an independent command, how to work with them to get the army to work. So that learning curve is something that Grant would have had no matter where he was, that's a significant leadership issue for him. Lee's basically doing the best he can to throw his men into this fight, hunker down, and invite the Federals to come at him. To Grant's credit, he's like, why am I playing this game? And decides to pull out. But it takes him. Yes, sir, go back.
During his whole wilderness campaign, Grant lost 50,000 men. Is that not true?
He's going to lose about 20,000 men during the wilderness.
On the 2 days?
Yes, the 2.5 days.
2.5
Yep,
days.
yep. Lee is going to have about 11,000 casualties. So obviously the Federals have the worst of it, but if we're looking at percentages, those are numbers Lee cannot sustain
Right.
long term.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Any supply chain issues for grain business?
Supply chain issues right now aren't too big of a deal. He's going to stretch that supply line from Culpeper all the way down to Spotsylvania. It's going to be a 30-mile supply line. But when he gets to Spotsylvania and he shifts the 9th Corps around to come down from the east, Burnside captures the Fredericksburg Road, which essentially allows Grant to shift his supply line from Culpeper to Fredericksburg. And the Army, of course, had operated there. They have all the infrastructure in place, so they're able to bring stuff down the Potomac to Aquia Landing on a railroad to Fredericksburg. It becomes a 10-mile instead of a 30-mile supply line. So it's a huge, huge logistical and strategic win for Grant. Nobody ever asks about logistics. So I'm like, oh, no. Well, you can't have that. You can't win the war if you don't have all that stuff.
You pointed out that Grant as Commander-in-Chief is at the operational level of the war dealing with Meade and the Army of the Potomac. Is he dealing with Sherman at the strategic level through his mobile telegraph or anything like that?
He is. You say mobile telegraph, it sounds so quaint and convenient. I always think, like, if they had cell phones, imagine how this would have been different. So yeah, he does have to send messages back to Culpeper, up the telegraph, and down. Sherman launches the Atlanta campaign a few days before Grant launches this, just because of the way the weather works out. Sherman's got more favorable weather to start sooner. And so they're going to be communicating. Grant's really hands-off with Sherman, though. He sort of lets Sherman do his thing. But yeah, he'll be in touch there. He'll be in touch with the Army in the Valley. He'll be in touch with Butler. So thank you so much for a warm homecoming welcome. I really appreciate it. Come pay for my daughter's I would love to see you on the bus in November. Please come down. I'd love to show off my local battlefield. So hopefully I'll see you. Thank you so much.
Okay, hold on.